what it's really important when we think about effective advocacy is understanding what we don't know. Understanding what we don't know, but also trying to be as informed about the issues that we're advocating for. And I think in this case, information really is power, right? And the idea really is not to replicate what we know, because that may not be the best practice, but it's about thinking outside of the box and looking outside of Trinidad and looking to other places where the issue of disability inclusion is taking place. I have to say that there's not one country that I've been to in the world, and I've been to many, where I feel that everybody's got it right. Everybody is still struggling to figure out what is the best way to include people with disabilities. Some countries have it better than the others, but there's not one place that's got it right. And so just be mindful of that. So when we talk about best practices and we talk about good examples, they often have their flaws as well. And I think, sometimes we're hard on ourselves, but we do need to recognize that it's not an easy process. And it's not an easy process because, disability is a social construct, right? And disability is something that, for most people, they either have no idea what it is, or they have visible fear, or they have subliminal fear, right? And I think because of that, we've seen these social norms around disability develop. I don't know Trinidad very well, so I'm not sure what the thing is, but in many countries that I travel to, in many African countries, they think about children with disabilities being disabled as a result of witchcraft. In South Asia, they think about children with disabilities being bad karma. So there's this whole mythology around children with disabilities. And why do I talk about that? I talk about that because once you start mythologizing a population, a people, it's easy for you to keep them out, right? And so I think there's very much an otherness that people have, and to be very honest, a fear. People will see me and say, oh my goodness, please get well. I'm not sick. But it's this notion that I need pity, I need to be cared for. I don't need pity, I don't need to be cared for, and I'm going to qualify that statement. What I need to be is independent. And this is absolutely essential for parents of children with disabilities and people who work with children with disabilities. The ultimate goal needs to be about how do you work with children to their maximum, not to standards of other children, to their own potential, so that they can be as independent as possible. And I'll come back to that in a bit. Sharada had asked me to speak briefly about some of the work that we're doing at the World Bank, and so I thought I'd start off by giving you a quick glance of what the World Bank does. So it's a bank, but it's not like Standard Bank or Barclays Bank. It's not a commercial bank. It's a development bank. And what this means is that we provide grants and loans to countries at very low, with a very low interest, right? And for grants, no interest whatsoever. We have a board of governors, and the board of governors is made up of the countries that basically are part of the United Nations. So Trinidad doesn't have a governor per se, but the Caribbean have a governor who sits, a director that sits on the board of governors. And then we have a whole range of different sectors in the bank. We have a sector that works on education, we have a sector that works on health, we have a sector that works on social development, transportation, energy, any kind of development issue that you can imagine. Probably somebody's working on it at the World Bank. The bank was established soon after the Second World War. At the time, the focus was really to help build up Europe. Europe had just gone through a devastating war, and the idea was how could they channel resources in to rebuild Europe. Well, it's moved on, substantially to look at rebuilding, financing, and supporting countries across the globe. We work in rich countries, or fairly rich developed countries, but our primary focus is on developing countries. And that's important because that depends to what extent are we able to grant or provide financing. What is the level, what is the GDP of the particular country that we're working in? And so I know you had asked about interest about loans and funding, and I'll talk to that a bit later. But just to say, one of the things that we do at the bank is we work very closely with our clients. And our clients are typically the government, right? And so what we do in a very collaborative process is to develop a system country diagnostic. And essentially what this is it's an analysis of, say, Trinidad. And it will present everything about, the political economy, the economics, what are the development gains, what are the development challenges. And this is important from the perspective of disability, because if we're able to ensure that in that process of identifying what Trinidad thinks its key issues are, development issues are, if we can identify disability, then it means somebody at the bank is going to be thinking about it, right? So I'm really happy when I see a systematic country diagnostic that mentions disability, because it means that there's somebody working on it, and it means that somebody's providing some intellectual prowess to deal with that. We, in addition to the country systematic diagnostics, we also have country partnership frameworks, and that's essentially a document, again with the client, usually always with the government, that says we have agreed to work on the following issues. And so if you want to think about it differently, think about it as the blueprint for the World Bank's engagement in country X. So around financing, this is the way we work. We finance projects by way of loans, credits, and grants, as I said. But we also have something that's called the development policy financing. And this is very interesting because what we do in this stream of financing is that we provide financing to a country to develop policy and institutional actions. So, for instance, if in Trinidad you were looking to develop an inclusive education policy, that would be something that the World Bank could potentially engage in. And we've done this in many countries. I worked on a project in Saudi Arabia, on financing for a policy on inclusive education. So we will finance policy and institutional actions. The other thing that we've introduced relatively recently is programming for results. The bank is very mindful that the resources that we have, the finances that we have, often come from other governments. So we are administering other people's finances. And so increasingly, we're looking at ways to make sure that we're financing for results, that we're financing so that at the end of the project, we can say, yes, we have built 20 schools, and 20 of the schools have a ramp and have an accessible bathroom. So that is something that we're working towards in terms of trying to get the right results. And then we provide advisory services, and this is a big part of my work. And so the brief that I shared, the knowledge brief, is precisely the kind of things that we do. We develop knowledge products that we share within the bank and we share outside of the bank. And the idea really here is to do a couple of things. One of them is for us to begin to think about, to your point around philosophy. One of the points that we're trying to push is to begin to develop a common language, a common understanding about what some of these concepts mean, right? Because inclusion means so many different things to so many different people. And what we're trying to do is to say, well, you know what? There are some international norms and standards that are out there that by law should frame the way we construct how we think about education, health, independent living, and so on and so forth. So for me, there's a really strong piece of my work which wants and seeks to develop good evidence so that we can use that evidence to influence policy and then to design projects. Because the last thing you want is to have bad research that then results in a project which is just terrible. So having the knowledge and having the evidence is so important for the process of advocating. And ideally, you want to have a common message as parents of children with disabilities or people who work in the sector. Because the last thing you want is to have a fractured system where some group is thinking they want to do that, and then the other group is thinking they want to do that, and another group is thinking they want to do that. You know, you might understand what your differences are, but for the Minister of Education, the Minister of Finance, they just look and they think, oh my goodness, this is so complicated, right? I have heard too many times people say, I have such a hard time understanding the disability sector. And these are officials that work on policy. One minute we have, representatives of the blind meeting, and they're saying, we want to have white canes, we want to have this, we want to have that. Then you have, representation of the deaf coming in and saying, no, actually, we want to have, sign language, but we don't want to be integrated into regular schools. And then you have another group that comes in and says, we want to make sure that everybody's integrated. Now, if you don't know and understand the dynamics of the movement, if you're sitting somewhere as a policy person, that is just overwhelming. Trying to get your head around that is just so overwhelming. And so I'm not suggesting that everybody have groupthink. I think there's a lot of value in people thinking, owning their thoughts. But I do think, for the purposes of moving this agenda, for advocating seriously about disability inclusion, it's really useful if we have principles to shape that. And fortunately, we do. So, just by looking at some of the global points and data points, I'm sure you all know that the world is made up of 15% of persons with disabilities. I'd be interested in knowing what the figure is in Trinidad. 80% of people with disabilities live in developing countries. And how is that? Well, that's because if you're considering countries like China and India, you've got huge populations there, so that already raises the figure considerably. And then you also need to think about disability as a diverse population group. I think too often when we think about disability, we think about disability either based on our own personal experience. So for me, obviously, when I go around, my disability antennae are looking for ramps, they're looking for accessible bathrooms, I'm looking for grab bars, and so on and so forth. But we have to remember, and this is so important from an advocacy point of view, that it is a diverse group of people, and that amongst persons with disabilities, We have people with physical disabilities, like myself, sensorial disabilities, mental and intellectual disabilities, right? And sometimes we have people with multiple disabilities. And we do ourselves a disfavor if we don't think about what this means in terms of the diversity within the disability community. I also want to put out there that we need to recognize that, you know, the population of persons with disabilities in many ways mirrors or reflects the population in which we live, or the demographics in which we live. And so, you know, you definitely will have class issues within the disability sector. You're going to have people who are disabled who come from rich families, you know, poor families, single-headed household families. So our situations are going to be very different, but they reflect what's happening in the rest of the world. Now, I like to think about disability as just part of our human diversity. I don't see it as anything but part of the human diversity. And I think when we think about it like that, it allows us to respect it, and it allows us to celebrate it. I was so thrilled to hear one of the mothers saying, you know, I'm a proud mother of a child with a disability, because that's not always the case. But if we're able to think about disability as something that is intrinsic to being human, then I think it's really important. So you can be disabled from birth, or you can be like me. I was disabled by way of a car crash. I was 27, I just graduated from law school. Or you start becoming disabled later on in your life as a result of illness, aging, all of those things. So I also see that there's a, you know, there's a pathway, and it's something that affects us all. Another thing that I think affects most people with disabilities in most countries is the barriers that we face, right? And I want to spend a bit of time talking about this because, to be honest, if we didn't have barriers that are environmental and attitudinal, then would I be disabled? If everywhere I went was fully accessible, if everybody accepted me and didn't have any prejudice and stigma against me, would I be disabled? I just would be Charlotte who uses a wheelchair, right? But I wouldn't necessarily be disabled. Does that make sense? Great. Exactly. Exactly. So it's interesting because the disabling factor comes in between me, I'm talking obviously, me and the environmental barriers. If you remove all those environmental barriers, there's nothing to stop me. And this is a fundamental point to think about when you're designing policy or designing any kind of advocacy campaign. Because when we think about inclusive education, we're saying, wait a second, just because Charlotte uses a wheelchair doesn't mean that she can't be the best kid in her class, right? Now, too often, unfortunately, assumptions have been made about me when they see me. And let me stop using myself because I'm a grown-up woman, but you know, if it was a kid, you make assumptions about that child, what she or he can or cannot do. You're making assumptions. And you may even go further than making assumptions and place that child in a school that doesn't give the child the stimulation or anything that the child needs. So, you know, that is a critical point for us to think about. Now, I have to also say that this does not mean that there aren't some children that require specialized stimulation, and all of the things that go with ensuring their ability to learn and to have some supports. So I'm not saying get rid of this to do this, but what I'm saying is we need to think about the best interest of the child. We need to think about systems that are inclusive, that provide supports to children to enable them to reach their fullest potential. One of the barriers that I think are most difficult to overcome are the attitudinal barriers, right? So environmental barriers, you can build a ramp, you can build an elevator, you can make sure the school is accessible, has the whatever needed. You can have, Braille if you're using Braille. You can have, the right programs on laptops if need be. You can have sign language interpreters if need be. So you can address those issues. You can address the accommodations. You can address most accommodations. But I find the real difficult piece is the attitudinal shift, where people really have made a decision based on assumptions, based on stereotypes, based on social norms and myths about what you can or cannot do. And that's really hard to change. It's also not something you can legislate for, right? You can legislate for ramps. You can have a universal design policy. You can legislate for sign language interpret. You can legislate for reasonable accommodations. But you can't legislate for people to change the way they see you. That has to be a different process. It has to be a process of unlearning and then relearning, or not relearning, but learning, right? Because what happens is we all have, let's be real here, we all have our unconscious biases. We have them. I like to think of myself as not having them, but there's a test that's been developed by Harvard, and it's called the implicit bias test. And I would advise you to go on. It's on the internet, and it's a really fascinating test because what it does is it quickly shows photographs, either on race, or one on gender, or one on disability. And you react to those pictures based on words. So it's via association. I like to think of myself as, knowledgeable, unbiased, engaging, and I won't tell you what my issues are, I've got them, but I was surprised by the test surprised me that we all have these unconscious biases, right? And so that's a really important thing to address. It doesn't mean we're going to necessarily get rid of them, but if you can call it, if you can name it, you know yourself, you're like, oh, I know it's coming, you know that it's happening. It's real. And it's very real amongst most of the population towards persons with disabilities. You can see, many of you are parents, you can see you come in with your child, and all of a sudden the body language is like, oh, what, either fear or kind of hesitation, people don't really know what to do, or the extreme, where they're all over you, right? So I think it's really important for us to think about that. Attitudinal barriers are very difficult, but they can be changed. And one way they can be changed is by running campaigns, having visibility of persons with disabilities. So television, people out and about, and just being visible is a good way of breaking that stigma. And being able to show people with disabilities that have really done good in their lives. Not only as, athletes, and trust me, I love the athletes, I think it's great, it's brilliant. I was in Rio for the Olympics, but just regular people. You need to normalize it. You can't have either the person who's begging or the Paralympian. There's got to be a medium somewhere in between. where it's like, okay, so Charlotte gets up, she goes to work, she comes back, she cooks, she doesn't cook. You have to normalize it. Otherwise, you keep it as other. So I think that that's an important piece to think about when we think about designing any efforts and any programs around advocacy. It's not about making your children special. They may be special to you, right? But in the collective, it's not about being special. It's about having rights and having the need to access services, right? And so that's a fundamental shift in terms of the way we design advocacy projects and policies. Also, I think one of the things that we fall short on, and I'm not suggesting this or implying that this be the case in Trinidad, but in many countries in which I've worked, often the parents' associations of children with disabilities focus exclusively on accessing services. And I can understand why. I can completely understand why, right? Because that's your immediate need, that's something you want to address. But we need to start thinking about how do we make our arguments more about how our children can actually benefit, and contribute to society, right? Because people don't want to be always, or governments don't want to be thinking about, all right, well, we're going to have to continue to support. The argument that I like to make is that if you help us support, we will in turn support. And that will enable the child to his or her best ability. And I keep on saying that because I do recognize that there are some children that really require, a lot of support. But what we want to do is to change the narrative. Change the narrative from what is it that the state can give me to how can this be seen as a partnership where you support, but in turn we will be part of the society and contribute to the society more broadly. My experience has also been that a large proportion, very large proportion, of persons with disabilities live in exclusion and in poverty. So the exclusion is based on not being able to jump out of bed, go down the street and get on a bus because the bus is not accessible. Right. Or it may be that the sidewalks don't have ramps. Or it may be that people just don't accept the fact that you can have a kid with CP who's doing X, Y, or Z. So there are a lot of things that push the exclusion of children with disabilities. And what that often results in is like, it's a vicious cycle, right? So you're excluded from school, you're excluded from university, you're excluded from the job market, and you end up in poverty. So it's this cyclical cycle that just keeps you out. In addition to that, you often have the household with a kid with a disability or a person with a disability with extra costs, right? So you're not just dealing with poverty, but now you have additional costs that are related to the disability. Right? So maybe it's buying a new wheelchair. I don't know about here, where I come from, they're really expensive. Maybe if you've got a kid with a disability, maybe it's about buying diapers for a really extended time, right? Maybe it's about having seating equipment. I mean, it's endless. I don't need to tell you that, you know. But that costs money, right? All those accommodations will cost you money. The other thing that will also cost money is that I can't just jump in, well, I can, but you can't just jump into a cab, right? Sorry, you can't just jump into a bus or a train. So you take a cab. A cab is more expensive. So there are all these hidden costs that are associated with the disability that I think we often don't think about, but are really real for families. And the research has shown us that families that have a child with a disability are often poorer as a result of the child being in a disability, having a disability, because you don't have access to services. The flip side of that, and this is the argument I was making earlier on, the flip side of that is that not including people with disabilities, so the cost of excluding people with disabilities from the labor market, is about 3 to 7% of loss of GDP. And if you want to get the ear of the governor of the Reserve Bank, or you want to get the ear of the finance minister, that's what you need to tell them. You need to say, by not including persons with disabilities, you are losing a substantial market gain. And that's really important, because we know that keeping people out, or people who are kept out, often then become a burden, in inverted commas, to their family. So that's a real piece to think about when we look at how do we design projects and programs for disability inclusion. Yes, please speak loud because I can't hear you.
How would we get statistics to support that?
Okay, so these statistics, the 3 to 7% of loss of GDP comes from the ILO, the International Labour Organization. And this research comes from research that was done in about 14 to 15 countries. So it's a pretty good sample. Ideally, if you could get, some smart researcher here to look at it, that would be great. To look and see to what extent people with disabilities are being employed in Trinidad. And then what's their salary scale, right? And then you can begin to extract, and then obviously if you know how many people you have, how many disabled people you have, you can begin to extrapolate. So I hear you saying that's a problem. Yeah, well, unfortunately it's a problem in many places, but we can talk about that a bit more. So I think we're moving into, in many ways, an interesting time for disability inclusion. We've seen at an international level a whole host of new commitments around disability inclusive development. One of them is the Sustainable Development Goals, right? And the great thing about the Sustainable Development Goals is that for the first time ever, this plan that is made up by UN members has recognized people with disabilities as a fundamental piece of the development agenda. And I was looking at the poster that was put up at the back there on the missing piece of the human rights puzzle being disability. I think we're closing that gap. And I think the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, have helped in that regard. The SDGs have 17 goals, and they make 7 references to disability per se, and then 11 references to inclusion more broadly. And for those of you who are interested in inclusive education, you'll be happy to know that Sustainable Development Goal number 4 speaks precisely to the issue around inclusive education. Another important international commitment is Habitat 3, which is the new urban agenda. And Habitat 3 met, so I think they meet every 10 years, and Habitat 3 met last year in Quito, in Ecuador, and they came up with this new urban agenda, and one of the aspects that they've woven into the urban agenda is issues around universal design. So designing cities, designing the urban space, designing, what do you call them here? Like shanty towns? Is that what you call them? Yeah, yeah, squatting. even to that extent, how do you design kind of informal sectors and settlements in a way that's accessible? So it's an important piece from a development agenda. The other one that's really interesting, and I've been doing some work on, is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And the Sendai Framework is basically a risk framework that helps us think through what do we need to have in place in order to address people with disabilities when there's a natural disaster in place. And I physically worked in Pakistan on the earthquake. After the earthquake, you remember the earthquake in 2006 in Pakistan? I went to Pakistan and we worked on, how to address the issue of persons with disabilities. It was very interesting because the focus was very much on those that had become disabled as a result of the earthquake. But which was a substantial number, it was over 60,000 people. But I was also really interested in where were the disabled people who were disabled before the earthquake, right? Were there plans in place to remove them from their homes when the earthquake happened? Where were they? Were the systems ready, aware of A, of their existence, and then B, of a plan? So this has become increasingly a big focus of international development work, trying to put in place plans ahead of time so that you know where people with disabilities are, and then obviously post-earthquake or post-natural disaster, how you can triage and make sure that you're including people with disabilities. The earthquake in Haiti was also an important reminder that we just don't plan enough for persons with disabilities when we design and develop disaster risk frameworks. I hope all of you know about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'm excited to know that since the last time I was here, Trinidad has ratified it. Yay for Trinidad, which is great, because it is a very instrumental and a very forceful treaty. Essentially, it's a human rights treaty that provides all of the protections, all of the right protections for persons with disabilities. And it has a number of articles, and it addresses in Article 7 children with disabilities. And that's really something that you should all read, because I think it provides a really good frame for how we think about children with disabilities within the context of human rights. But essentially, this treaty speaks to the issue of non-discrimination, but also obliges the government, primarily, because the government is the duty bearer. The government has the responsibility to provide on rights. It obligates the government to provide for women with disabilities, children with disabilities. It looks at the right to education in Article 24. It looks at rehab and rehabilitation. It looks at living in the community. So it looks at a whole host of issues as per article. And related to the point on advocacy, the convention has in Article 9 an entire article on awareness raising. And this is rather unusual in international treaties, to have an entire article on awareness raising. And the reason they have that is precisely for the things that we've been talking about, is that too often people just have no idea. It's just not on the radar screen. And so this article really helps us think about how do we combat stereotypes, how do we combat prejudice, how do we roll back a lot of those attitudinal barriers that I spoke about. So really, I strongly recommend you reading the convention. I have a little one like that big. I take it everywhere I go. And every time I read it, I realize that there's something new that I'm finding in the convention. But the convention is important because it provides legal parameters and a legal framework for us to advance disability inclusion. Another important piece that I'd like to talk about is a World Bank and World Health Organization report that came out in 2011, and it's called the World Report on Disability. And it's available online, and it's actually an excellent, yes? What? The name is the World Report on Disability, 2011, and it was done by the World Bank and WHO, World Health Organization. And this report is really good because it was the first kind of evidence-based report on disability. And it takes you through all the stages of disability. It helps you define, it helps you understand disability. It talks about the various definitions that we have around disability. It talks about how to measure disability, how to collect data on disability, on education, on health, on an enabling environment. And then towards the end, it has a section on recommendations. So our chapter 9 of the report has a section on recommendations that obviously would be useful in designing any kind of advocacy and campaign. So, and they're really focused, those recommendations are focused very much on what is it that governments can or should be doing. So get your hands on that report. It's online. It's a really bulky report, but it's well done in that you can also just pull the chapter that you're interested in reading. So if you just want to read on education, you can pull the education one. So and there's a lot of kind of work that's gone around that, supporting it. So definitely advise it as an important piece to read. You know, at the World Bank, we're also going through a process of beginning to think internally about our own policies. So we've been saying to our clients, oh, you need to start including people with disabilities, but I always say you've got to be able to walk the talk. What are we doing ourselves as an institution? And so one of the things that we are doing is we've just gone through a major review of all of the policies of the World Bank for our operations. And we've made them basically more modern. And in so doing, we've introduced the notion of non-discrimination. And in that regard, we've now introduced disability, we've introduced universal access, we've introduced the need for consultations on any World Bank project, and that in consultations you should look to include persons with disabilities, and you should have available accessible formatted materials to share with them. And that's a fundamental switch for the bank to really see us as not just an interlocutor, not just somebody who's working with the client, but very much somebody who's saying, we need to make sure that we're holding true to inclusion as well. And this is a trend. This is definitely a trend in terms of bilateral donors. So I would imagine that the donor that's possibly most engaged in Trinidad would be USAID. USAID has, for the longest time, had a policy on disability. But now the UK aid group, DFID, has put out a policy. The Australians have put out a policy. So increasingly we're seeing, the Germans have a policy on disability inclusion. And increasingly they're saying, we can't justify using taxpayers' money without including people with disabilities. So if we're going to give country X a grant for whatever, we want you to include persons with disabilities, which is very good. Any questions around that? Okay, I'll go on. Yes? Yeah, it covers social protection. I can pull it. It covers social protection. It covers, I'll tell you in a second. I don't, I don't have the entire report in my head, but it covers social protection. It covers education, as I said. It covers transportation. It covers enabling environments. I mentioned that. It addresses barriers to employment. There's a large section on employment, which is really useful. And basically, it also has a section on how to involve persons with disabilities. So, you've got all these different aspects. I mentioned the data piece. What else? Oh, health. Yes, there's a section on health as well. So take a look at, whatever you're interested in, the report has it covered. The bank works primarily with governments, so they're our clients. But what happens if your client or the government is actually not really implementing either their own laws, or in some instances, there are no laws, right? What does the bank do? And he was asking, can the bank support other groups? So typically, we support governments, right? There are instances where we support local organizations, and that is usually done by way of a grant, right? But that usually is around a specific issue. So maybe it's education. Actually, we've had some in education. We had one in Malawi. It was a grant from the Japanese. So the Japanese provide trust funds to the bank that we administer. And then we design with a group. In the case of Malawi, it was with a group of disabled people, like you guys, a consortium. We designed a project. I was the program manager at the World Bank for the project. And the project was to look at a number of schools in 3 districts. And in each of those schools, to make the schools accessible, to train the teachers, to develop training manuals for teachers, to work with parents. And I was insistent that we need to make sure that we also have parents on the school, parents of children with disabilities on the school governing body, so that they can be part of making decisions as well. So yes, we do have, we can provide grants, but typically our main partner is the government. We negotiate with the client. We don't tell the client what to do, right? We can't go in and say, you will build X, Y, and Z, you will include children with disabilities. We advise. We negotiate, we advise. Now, if I'm working with somebody who's designing a project, what we will do is we will try to build in a component on disability, right? But at the end of the day, it's the Ministry of Finance that's either taking the loan or whatever, and they'll say, you know what? And this is real. You'll get, ministry saying, okay, so this looks great. We wish we could do this, but we're not in a position right now to address the disability thing. We take out the disability component. Now, with these new regulations that I talked about, the new framework for the bank, that's going to change, because now it's going to be required for them to do it. So that's very exciting. It's very exciting. The bank doesn't necessarily use the criteria of the convention to determine our engagement. It's something that we like, it's a good practice, but it's not necessarily, so for us it wouldn't be, if you haven't introduced all the articles, then we won't be able to support you. So yeah, there are some organizations that do. They will require that you've actually shown commitment, and more than commitment, in terms of the articles. So remember I said at the beginning that I think if you as you think about advocacy and developing any kind of campaigns for children with disabilities, I think there are a couple of principles that you need to think about. Non-discrimination. That one is, for me, it's non-negotiable, non-discrimination, period, right? But let's think about non-discrimination a bit, because discrimination can be both overt or covert, right? It can be intentional or it can be unintentional, right? So if somebody, let's think about the example of work, no, of school. It's the environmental social framework that I spoke about on the earlier slide, the new policies for the World Bank. Yeah. So let's think about the beginning of the year, and the school puts out, I would imagine, you know, parents will make applications for their kids to go to school. And the school says, we take all children. Right? We don't discriminate. Equal opportunity, we take all children. So then you decide, all right, let's try this out. And you get there, and there are steps. Or the principal says, well, I'm sorry, we can't take your kid because we don't have the necessary supports for that. Whatever the reason is. In my mind, not only in my mind, but that constitutes discrimination. You're discriminating against that person on the basis of his or her disability, right? And it wasn't the school's intention to discriminate. The school was saying, we'll take everybody, we will take all. But by not providing the reasonable accommodations, or by not having reasonable accommodations in place that, as per the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, constitutes discrimination. The overt discrimination is a sign that will say, we do not accept children with disabilities. Right? So there's a difference in the way discrimination works. And that happens in the labor market, it happens, you know, in schools, it happens in health. It happens in most facets of life where you have this kind of direct discrimination or the more kind of nuanced indirect discrimination. So I think if you're thinking about any kind of campaigns, again, advocacy, non-discrimination for me is a no-go. Equal opportunities is really important, right? Because remember, we're talking about changing the narrative around disability. It's not just about providing services. It's about giving people opportunities. It is not just about accessing services. Services should be a given. Equal opportunities are something that we need to strive for. And then reasonable accommodations is really important. You'll tell from my presentation that my bias is obviously around universal access and accessibility because I use a wheelchair, right? So that's my point of analysis. I keep on going back to that. And so for me, I look to see in new buildings, have they addressed issues around access? Have they implemented the law? You've got an entire Article 9 in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities on accessibility. Accessibility is also a good starting point for advocacy and for campaigns because while yes, it's more leading towards people with mobility-related impairments, it's also good for everybody, right? So the argument I make in the bank is, if you're going to design if you're going to refurbish or redesign a downtown part of country X, it's in everybody's interest to make it accessible for all, right? So, I mean, obviously it gives me greater ease of movement, but it's going to be good for my mom, It's going to be good for, you know, a young woman with, or father with a push cart. It's good for travelers who may be pulling bags. I mean, it's just good design, right? And the thing is, we can do that. We can design in a way that makes it useful and better for more people than it does for less. And we're beginning to see some cities that are beginning to do this. So in terms of good practices around universal access and design, I think for me, one of the cities that's probably most accessible, again, from a mobility point of view, has got to be Barcelona in Spain. I mean, for me, it's like heaven. It's just like they've thought about everything. And so that's really exciting. In Sweden, we're seeing some really good accessibility features being built into the main cities, but also some of the smaller towns. The other thing that is useful to think about in relation to universal access is that there's this myth that universal design or universal access is more expensive or is going to cost you so much more than if you didn't include it. And this is why research is important. So we've done the research, and we found out through our research that the cost of addressing accessibility from the get-go, from the beginning of the project, is only 1 to 3% of the overall cost of the project, which is nominal, 1 to 3%. However, if you don't do that, and you come back to retrofit, it's going to be a lot more. And that's if you do come back to retrofit, because often that ship has sailed, right? So again, using those type of statistics, using that kind of logic for campaigns is really useful to press and to impress upon policymakers what the value add is of inclusion. Right? Because we know now, as you said, you've ratified the convention. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's been translated into action. So we need to find other strategies. And the other strategy is to show what is the value added. The other points that I just wanted to mention, I mentioned them earlier on, was the importance of having consultations, and that doesn't necessarily apply to you, but I think the issue here is having a way to have a common voice and to make sure that you're providing common messages. So I guess I often ask myself, so why do we do the work that we do? Why do we do the work around, why do I do the work around disability inclusion? Why does my team do the work around disability inclusion? Well, I think what we're really striving for, and this comes back to the earlier point around a philosophy or a concept, and that's we're all trying to really build inclusive societies. In societies that are inclusive for everyone. Societies that don't differentiate whether I can get an education or not based on my disability, right? So we need to look at inclusive and sustainable economic growth, and we really need to be aggressive about leaving no one behind. And this is a slogan that came out of the Sustainable Development Goals, leave nobody behind. And what we know is that leaving people behind, or those that are left behind, are often persons with disabilities. We know that. So again, this is messaging for advocacy. It's about investing in all, but then being targeted and deliberate about ensuring that people with disabilities are included. Because if you don't do that, we go back to the scenario of the school that says, bring all the children, but oh, sorry, we can't take your kid because we haven't thought about the supports. I mentioned the value of building for all or having an inclusive society is one that really also looks at older people. It may not be the case in Trinidad, but in many countries we have a demographic of a lot more older persons. And that obviously has a relationship to disability and certainly has a relationship to accessible design and inclusion. I have a couple of examples here that I wanted to share quickly with you that just gives you maybe the breadth and the depth of the work that we do. The one on the slide right now is a project that we worked on in China, and it's a transportation and urban project. And basically, the idea here was to improve accessibility for persons with disabilities. And the effectiveness of this project was that we worked with people with disabilities. Thank you. We worked with people with disabilities. And, this is a really important piece of information to keep in mind. If you're designing a project, speak to people with disabilities. If you're designing a project for children with disabilities, speak to parents of children with disabilities. If you're designing a project for children with disabilities, speak to the children with disabilities. You need to engage the people that you're designing for or having a campaign around. So again, these projects were successful because we went out, we made an effort, and we worked with people with disabilities. I mentioned social protection as one of the chapters in the World Disability Report, and it'll be interesting for you to know that through one of the grants, you asked earlier on about our different, can we fund organizations? Through one of our grants, we supported a project in Jamaica that looked at the social and economic inclusion of persons with disabilities. And we trained 336 people with disabilities. And what was really fabulous about this job was that the success rate of the training was so high. 77% were all then went on to get jobs. So, that was a really good project. And I think for me, this also was a great project because what it did do was to address some of the social aspects around disability or the exclusion of persons with disabilities, but also to talk about economic inclusion. Because remember the beginning I said, high numbers of people with disabilities, high levels of poverty. Now, if we're really serious about this, we need to start thinking about how we have economic inclusion of persons with disabilities. Any questions or thoughts on that? Okay, so education. So in the introduction, a few of you mentioned your interest in inclusive education. It's an area where we've been doing quite a bit of work at the bank. One of the most successful best practices that I think we have to date is a project in India. It's an Education for All project, classical, all children. But when they started the project, or when they were like midway in the project, they realized that we're actually not reaching all children. We're reaching maybe 92% of the children, maybe 89%. Who are the 10% that we're not reaching? And so they came to the bank. The Indian government came to the bank and said, okay, we have a problem here. We've got this universal primary education project. We want to have 100% of children in school. We've done not too badly. We're at the 89, 90 mark. But we're struggling to figure out who the last 10% are and then how we can bring them into the system. So we designed some projects working with Indian educationalists and obviously with the government. And what we did there was to design a project that was able to work through parents, empower parents, because in many instances, it could be the parent that's reluctant to have the child go to school in the first place. There are things that can be done, And that then helps you release some of your frustrations so that you can focus on your daughter, you can focus on yourself, and make sure that we get things to be as light as possible for you as we can. So let's think about that tonight and then think tomorrow a bit more about what that might look like, because there really are a number of options. Just to pick up on the India program, what we did was we then developed 4 training manuals for teachers. And we developed training manuals on inclusive education for children with autism, children with CP, children who are deaf, and children who are deafblind. And for many teachers, I went to India to run workshops with the teachers. For many teachers, they had never even encountered a child who was deaf, let alone a child who was deafblind. So there was a lot of just kind of getting over their own stigma and prejudice before they could think about teaching. And again, some of this knowledge already exists, right? The India training manuals are very context specific, so they refer a lot to Indian culture. But there are a whole variety of training manuals for teachers on inclusive education. So whatever you do and whatever you advocate, I always ask that you do the research beforehand. Don't reinvent the wheel. Going to a donor and saying, oh, we want to do, training, we want to develop guidelines on inclusive education. They're already there. What you need to do is to take them and adapt them so that they fit the context of Trinidad. And that's really, that's key. So for the research, what we do is something called a reimbursable technical assistance. So basically the government pays the World Bank to do the research. And then we bring in and work with local people to develop the research. We've got the research methodology, we'd use it, and we'd do the data, analyze the data, and then have the research available for that. And then on the funding piece, if there's a project, again, like I said in Malawi, we worked through an organization of disabled people that had engagement with government to make schools accessible. So if there was a group here that was able to come together and pull together a proposal, I could submit it from the bank side to see if there were projects that we could support or a project that we could support here. So it's doable, but ideally it requires some engagement with government, because you want to use it as a way of changing the systemic issues. What we're not looking at is just putting in a grant for a small project. If we can show the value that this project can fundamentally change and impact the system, then certainly something we could look at supporting. So I had mentioned disaster risk management. It's an area that I said is very important. There's a picture on the screen of a young man in a wheelchair in a flood. In this case, they had thought about what it would mean to provide support for persons with disabilities. So the guy next to him was able to rescue him and make sure that he found himself in a place of refuge. An area that we haven't spoken about this morning that I think is really important is the whole issue around digital development. The world is coming more and more digitized, right? And in fact, there's a study from the World Bank that shows there are billions of cell phones on the planet, billions. And some people have more than one. Granted, there's some people that don't have access, and we know that there are people that don't have access even to the internet, so that's something to be mindful of. But the potential and the power of accessible technology for families and for children with disabilities is exponential. thinking about parents that are looking at homeschooling, just using technology can just be so empowering, so liberating. It connects you, it helps you share. So I raise this because I think often we think about technology as something that maybe we just do with our phones, but we don't think about how we can really build it into our learning. And I think, again, it has tremendous, tremendous value for us if we think about children with disabilities in particular. We did an interesting project in Tunisia where we looked at providing assistive technologies or accessible ICT solutions to schools. And by doing so, we were able to train 8,370 students. Students that would not have had an education, but we were able to bring in accessible ICT. Maybe it had JAWS on it, maybe it had whatever the need was, we were able to support that process. And we've also looked at accessible digital courses for children with intellectual and learning disabilities, where we've reached 5,000 children. That's a lot of children. So I think, we also need to start looking at how we can use social media, how we can use, digital technology to really take us forward. For training, we don't have to all be in the same room for training these days. You can develop modules online. You can do so much work online. You can design, you can set up platforms, you can design courses that speak to the nuances of the country. So I'm a great fan of using digital technology because I really think that if used properly, it can be a major disruptor. And it can be particularly useful when you're thinking about campaigns and/or any form of advocacy. I also wanted to share with you 2 other projects that I've worked on. Often people wonder why we have a project on water and what's the relevance to disability. Well, there's a lot of relevance to disability because in many of the countries in which we work, water and sanitation is absolutely fundamental. It's fundamental for your health and it's fundamental for your well-being. And too many times, even when I travel to developing countries and I go into the villages and I need to go to the bathroom, you can see everybody's like, oh boy, what do we do now? There are no facilities there for people with any kind of mobility issues. And that obviously has serious implications. We also found that in very remote areas where perhaps the work that we're doing is supporting the building of public or collective faucets, pumps, that they have like 3 or 4 steps going up, which means if you've got a mobility impairment, you're not going to get up there. It also means it's kind of hard on your back if you're trying to carry that water anyway. So what we've been trying to do is to get the colleagues within the World Bank to think about when they design these projects, to think about access. And so on the screen you'll see there's a picture of a little bathroom, it was a toilet in Indonesia at a school. And it's super basic. It's got a little, the picture's not too good, but it's got just a little cement ramp. It's wide enough, and you have an accessible bathroom. And that can be used for the school. It can be used for community activities when the school is out of session. It can be used for voting. Politicians like to hear that, So the thing is, you can actually make some quick gains with some nominal fees. And so, as I had said earlier on, one of our functions is to develop the analytics and the research. We developed an entire guidance note for the World Bank and for our partners on how to include people with disabilities in water operations, right? And hopefully we're going to see more traction in that space. And then recently, just in December, I was in Uruguay. And in Uruguay, we're working on a really interesting project, which is focusing on accessible tourism. So Uruguay is, Montevideo is a city that a lot of the cruises stop on, right? And so what's been happening is that the cruise ships arrive, and the people that are coming out of the cruise ships are increasingly older people, or people with some needs. And so the city is starting to think, how do we use this as a niche? How do we make sure that when the ship docks, we can ensure that our hotels are accessible, we have accessible transportation, we have accessible bathrooms, we have accessible hotels. So they've seen it as an economic trigger, right? They've seen it as an economic trigger. Making and designing your tourism sector in a way that is going to increase tourism of people who've been excluded, right? But also how you can use tourism as a space to ensure that you employ people with disabilities. So it's an interesting mix. One of my colleagues returned recently from Mexico City, and he was so excited because he said at the airport, all the people that were welcoming you into the country, you know, you have people at the airport that say, welcome to Mexico City. He said they were all people with disabilities. They were all people with disabilities. And he said that just gives you, he said, you know, immediately you start thinking about it. You start thinking about disability, and it also tells you a lot about what is the image that this country is trying to portray. Right? That's not a difficult thing to do. We have to think about the unconventional methods. We have to think about where do we impact people the most? Where do we interact with people the most? You know, I live in Washington, D.C., and I see every day 10 to 15 people with visible disabilities on their way to work. Why? Because you've had inclusive schools, you've had universities, kids who've gone on to university, you've had kids who've graduated, kids with disabilities that now can hold down jobs. You have accessible infrastructure, you have accessible transportation, you have laws that support people in employment, so you have reasonable accommodations. So it's normalized the situation. And then I go to a developing country and I don't see any disabled people, none. And I say, where are your disabled people? In Bangladesh, they put tactile, braille trails, tactile, in some parts of the city. And so they had like tactile coming down maybe 3 blocks and then turn, and then maybe another 2 blocks, and then it stopped. And there was literally a big pole in front of the tactile. I mean, that's dangerous, it's ridiculous, but obviously they didn't work with a blind person to say, what would be the best pathway for us to put the tactile down on? And what you don't want to do is to start a process that's laudable and necessary and mess it up, essentially. When we think about inclusion, and we think about full participation of people with disabilities, we need to think about it on a continuum, all right? So we started to talk about inclusive, actually backtrack a bit. Early diagnosis and assessments for all children is absolutely essential, because that helps to then introduce interventions and supports to families and to the child from a very early age. Having support systems is absolutely essential, and support systems that range from severe disabilities to mild disabilities. I think the other place where we've spoken a lot about is the whole area around education. We didn't talk a lot about the curriculum, but that's an important area for advocacy and for policy change. I'm working on a project in Guyana that that's looking at education reform, including the reform of the curricula. And so what we've tried to do there is to introduce individual learning plans for children and really impress upon the teachers different methodologies for teaching children and finding ways to develop flexible curricula that will allow children who have diverse learning needs to participate in the classroom. And then I think when we think about, how people access services, how people access the labor market, we then obviously have to think about how people move around. What's their mobility? What is the transportation? What's transportation like? Is it accessible? It's great to hear that accessible buses are coming into place, but are the sidewalks accessible? In India, they've done an amazing job of making the metro accessible. But when I speak to university students in Delhi, they say, that's great, the train is accessible, but we can't get to the train. Because getting out of our house to the train station is inaccessible. So we would have to arrange special transport anyway, so we might as well just take the special transport all the way to school. So I think what is really useful is to think about the continuum and think about it as a pathway, right? We're building blocks. We're moving gradually towards what we're hoping to achieve, which is a society that's fully inclusive. And I think the burden of that is really on people with disabilities themselves and/or parents. It shouldn't be that way. It should be everybody's responsibility, but that's just the reality. And so what I would like to close this off with by saying is, I've found that the most successful advocacy and campaigns have been based on good evidence. If you're able to have good information, solid information, statistical information, that really makes it difficult for the policy person to say, no, not really, then you're in good stead. I think the other important advocacy piece is, I'll say it again, the power of your personal story and being able to articulate yourselves and share what it is that you experience as parents of children with disabilities and/or people with disabilities. And then I think somebody said earlier on, the importance of being a parent, or the advice she would give to other parents of disabilities would be to be relentless. And that's about not letting go and being engaged in as many different policy areas that you can be, because they are connected. There's a connection that's happening there. And you don't want to end up with a brilliant inclusive education policy that nobody knows about, right? So the idea is really to think about connecting the dots. I think we spent a lot of time, maybe directly, maybe indirectly, kind of fleshing out what are some of the barriers that we experience in relation to inclusion of persons with disabilities and/or in particular children with disabilities. And on quick reflection, I listed a couple of issues that I thought I'd throw out, and then if we could discuss that a bit, and then tomorrow we can kind of think a bit more about what solutions we can present, because it's great to identify barriers, but it's really important to start identifying solutions so that we're not caught up in that holding pattern of just saying, this is what's wrong with the system, and we're not contributing to say, this is what we can make happen. So let's do this interactively. I'm going to throw out what I heard, but I would like you all to be part of this process and hear what you heard. So I definitely heard there are barriers in terms of lack of services, accessible services. I heard prejudice and discrimination remains a very strong barrier for inclusion. I heard poorly implemented policies and/or translating policies into action remains a hurdle, stroke barrier. I heard that the lack of relevant knowledge about support systems is also a barrier. I heard generally that inaccessible environments poses barriers. I heard, and I think we all felt very much that, one of the barriers is the strain that having a child with a disability can put on a family and or a parent. And I think that's something that we often don't talk about enough. I also heard about the hidden costs associated with disability, right? So the additional things that parents have to pay for because they have a child with a disability, when a family without a child without a disability wouldn't have to be paying those costs. So there are those additional costs or hidden costs, as I like to think about as. I definitely heard that while there's some resources in terms of learning resources, there also is very much a lack of resources or a lack of understanding where those resources are, how to access them. So those were some of the things that I heard, but I'd be really interested in hearing from you. What were some of the barriers that you heard us talk about collectively, or some of the barriers that I might have spoken about?
Yes, a session we had earlier on where somebody was saying that the person is deaf and they needed an interpreter, but the police wanted to provide their interpreter and the person did not want to use the police interpreter. They wanted an independent interpreter. So that's a barrier for communication on both parties.
Yeah.
Handicap parking. So because there's no law that says you can't. It encourages illegal activities too. Because there's one guy who, if you call him, he will give you a handicap sign for your car so that nobody can move you because you have a handicap sign. Yeah.
In South Africa, the Disabled People's Association worked with the Ministry of Transportation and Urban Design, I think, so that to address the issue around parking spaces, they were able to get signposts. This was obviously negotiated with the ministry. So the signposts say this parking space is reserved only for persons with disabilities who have a valid sticker, and a fine of $400 or something will be imposed on anybody who doesn't have a sticker, who parks in this spot, and the fine will go to the Organization of Persons with Disabilities. Kind of clever, right?
I don't like tags. I don't like it. I see why it works, because then if you don't have the tag, they can clamp your wheel. But I don't know that I should put a tag saying, my daughter is in the, somebody in this car is using a wheelchair. I don't
So
know how
else would you monitor it? So like
I see it as a
I have a
monitoring
tag that's
tool.
removable. You
Yeah.
can take it
so
off
I
and
see
on.
it as a monitoring tool, but just from a social work perspective, it's like a flag that promotes marginalization.
So, I mean, I think that's an interesting point to think about. When we start tagging things or when we start watching things, how people react. And there's this very interesting experiment where there's an honesty box in front of a coffee maker in an office. And the idea is that you just put in your little cents, you take coffee, and you put in how much you think your coffee costs, right? Let's say $1, right? I mean, and people will usually put in about 15 cents, 20 cents. Very seldom do people put in the $1. So somebody decided to do this experiment, and what they put in front of the coffee maker was like a picture, right? And the picture had flowers and blossoms. And when people would go and take the coffee and see those flowers and blossoms, they would put very little money, like less than usual. And then Monday, Tuesday, say Wednesday, they changed the picture from the flowers and they put a set of eyes. And all of a sudden, the amount began to spike of how much people were putting into the honesty box. So people were saying, people were then putting $1, some people were even putting $1.25. The next day, and they did this over a period of months to kind of measure it, right? To see to what extent, these type of things play out. And so afterwards, they came up with this great graph that showed where you had a picture of flowers and everything kind of nice and rosy, people kind of thought, oh, well, yeah, it's a nice thing to do, but it's not necessarily something I feel I have to do. And a set of eyes that were in a picture, but watching you, triggers something in your mind that somebody's watching me. And I think it's a really interesting experiment just in terms of the way our brain works, right? And so, I mean, yeah, that's kind of to the tag point, I guess.
Yeah, so, it's this thing called othering. And so it's already an issue with persons with disabilities. And the more you tag yourself as being different, you are othering the population, as we say. So I try to avoid it. And to me, labeling plays into that whole othering. And that's how vulnerable groups get categorized over time.
So I completely understand your point around othering. I do, however, think that, we could argue a bit on this, because then somebody would say to me, why do you need to have a special parking spot? Just go park with everybody else, right? If you don't want to be othered. But my argument is that the reason I need a special parking spot is not because I want to, be able to find parking. I mean, that's nice. But it's because I need more space to open the door, to put my chair down, to assemble my chair, to get out, to having, space to rotate and turn. If somebody's being assisted, for that to happen. So I don't see that necessarily as othering. I see it as an accommodation. And I think there's a fine line. There's a fine line between othering and accommodation. And that plays itself out really when you think about the labor markets, right? And how people access, the labor market. In the US, they have in government, they have, it's called Schedule A, where people with disabilities have priority to access jobs, right? It doesn't mean that you don't have merit. So it's like affirmative action, essentially, but for people with disabilities, right? But it doesn't mean that any random disabled person can come. You have to be qualified and you have to have merit. But they will look at you as a way of trying to reach some of their federal figures that they want to increase around disability in the workforce. Now, a lot of people will argue, as people have argued around affirmative action, that that's unfair. That, you're giving, black students a chance to get into university, or you're giving disabled students a chance to excel not even excel, to enter the markets. My argument, or my thinking behind that, is that that's not discrimination. Those are positive measures. Those are measures that are trying to address imbalances and trying to address the playing fields, right? So that's something that you need to think about when you push for policies. It's. I wish I had that. I'll find it and show it tomorrow. There's this diagram that I like, and it really shows, that while we're all trying to get equality, we come in at different levels. So you can't just say everybody comes in at the first level. Some people need a hand up. Some people need to get a bit higher, right? And that's a useful thing to think about. Now, this doesn't mean that all disabled people need that. A lot of disabled people don't need to have that additional support, but many do. And so that's a consideration when we think about positive measures that support groups that have been traditionally excluded. And then positive measures are being used in many places to address gender gaps, right? They're looking at how to make sure you're having gender parity. What you're doing is saying, we will look favorably, not exclusively, but we will look favorably at hiring women. And you're doing that because, you know, corporate America or whatever has traditionally been male-dominated. So it's an interesting way of trying to, it's like trying to redress imbalances. But again, I think it can be a fine line, and of course it can be abused. There's no question about that. Any other barriers? Somebody mentioned earlier on when we started to talk about legal that there was an issue around costs. Is that a big thing here? The cost of having legal challenge? Attorney fees? Nobody does work pro bono? Just asking. No, I'm asking because, again, I've known increasingly we're seeing a jurisprudence that's being developed around inclusion of children with disabilities. There's a study that's looked at a number of countries that has researched the courts to see to what extent people are challenging the policies or challenging the laws to move towards inclusion. And some of them have been pretty good. Court cases from constitutional courts that have said schools will from hitherto include children with disabilities with the necessary supports, requiring the ministries to then provide the necessary resources, training of teachers. So people are using the legal stream, and this is I'm a lawyer, so I kind of always fall back on that part of the world. Yeah.
Well, I will tell you my experience with trying it. So when I tried to get my daughter schooling when she turned 5, because according to our law, mandatory schooling from age 5 to 16, right? And I was unable to get public schooling for her. So I went through all the different departments in the Ministry of Education, and then I sought legal advice. The lawyer asked me at the time if I knew of other parents who were having a similar experience, and he would be willing to take
a
it
class action.
That's right. I could find no other parents willing. Yes? I spoke with persons from the deaf community. In fact, I called the head of one of the NGOs. And she told me that, you know, the deaf community, they have their own culture. The parents are not willing to speak to outsiders. And so I can speak through her, give her information, she will pass it on. So that went nowhere.
Yeah.
And I've said over the years to parents, and no one, so that while we complain a lot, when it comes down to actually wanting to take like actual action, I don't see that happening in this country. So
I mean, I think that raises an interesting big point, because I think there's some countries, like certainly the US is like super litigious, like everything ends up going to court. In India, a lot of the changes has happened by way of court rulings. Countries that have constitutional democracies often have like strong involvement of the courts. I know in South Africa, the courts have played a very strategic role in terms of pushing the education system to be more inclusive. But yeah, I mean, it's one of the many strategies that I think that are out there.
I mentioned before our own, barriers within the community. So Mary's example is prime in reference to stuff like that. Something as simple, not even legal, but getting a petition signed to have a statement retracted by a minister in reference to everyone being, you know, we have an inclusive educational system, which is far from true. This was put out in the media a couple months ago, and getting signatures for that is pulling teeth in itself. Everybody speaks about it in different forums, but when it's time for people to step up and show that support, it's not there. Because everybody is wondering about whatever little subvention they're getting or they're not getting, or whose shoulder they're rubbing with and might become offended because they are associated. But if we're in a cause for one main goal, which is to be included, we can't think of those other things to actually bring that forward. And not until we break these barriers that we have within ourselves, then and only then. Because her experience may be to bring it, a legal action and that sort of stuff. But if she's not getting the support and can't afford the fees of the attorney, and who is the attorney that's going to take it pro bono, as they say, because of they're thinking of their affiliations with whomever. So how do we win this over? How do we get, friend and not turn foe, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a very important consideration. What you don't want to do is to be, the persistent enemy. That doesn't really help anybody. But I think, again, if you're able to come up with facts, with the evidence around how your daughter is not able to get into school, and, really having a narrative that makes it very difficult for somebody to say, you're just picking on me because I'm the minister, right? You're compelling them to say, here are the deficiencies in my policy, in our policy. And you're not saying, take my child and I'll do nothing. You're saying, I want to be part of this process. And it's not just, and this is important, and it's not just about my child. It's about the collective. And I think that's really called strategic litigation, where we are not just looking for one case, one person's issue. I mean, that can fundamentally change a lot. But if you're able to show that an entire group is being excluded on the basis of their disability for no other reason but for the basis of disability, then it's considered strategic litigation. And my experience is that courts tend to like to go with that. So the other thing I was thinking about as an important entry point for monitoring what the government is doing in terms of implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is that once a government ratifies the convention, every 4 years they have to submit a report. They have to submit a government report, and they have to submit what's called either an NGO support or a shadow report, right? And Trinidad has only just ratified the convention, so it means it's still probably about to submit their first report. So the state will submit their report in terms of what they're doing in relation to the convention, but then civil society organizations, disabled people's organizations, will submit a shadow report. That is a really important process for parents of children with disabilities to be involved in, because that report goes to the UN and is considered by experts and will be used to supplement the report that's provided for by the government. And it's really interesting, if you look at the reports from the government and you look at the reports by the NGOs, or the disabled people's organizations, sometimes it looks like two different countries, right? The government one says, oh, we're just so good, we've got all these policies, we've done training, we include all children. And then you look at the NGO report and they say, yes, you may have these policies, but they're not being enforced. And no, you're not retaining teachers. And so it's a very useful process. But it's also a process that can be used to coordinate. If we're so used to having disabled people around us, if it's been normalized, then we don't think of people as being disabled. We just think about people being, maybe they don't see. So, but it doesn't mean that they can't participate in society. They might use a program to use there are supports there, right? But we have to work towards removing the stigma and the shame that's associated with it, and that in many ways is kind of the first first port of call. And that, as I said, is not something that you can pass a law for. It's got to be something that's done by way of campaigning, by changing people's mindsets. So you move away from a paradigm of thinking about disabled people as a pity to people who are empowered and have agency and voice. I mean, I'll tell you a story and then conclude. So actually it was a long time ago. I was in front of the church and I was waiting for a friend. And I had a can of soda, like in between my legs, because that's the easiest place for me to put it, because then I'm able to move around, right? So I'm standing in front of the church with the Coke in my hand. Between my legs, like this. Like so. And this little old lady comes towards me. She looks at me. She opens her handbag, and I'm like, oh no, you're not doing this. You are not doing this. She opens her handbag. She takes out a little purse. And I'm like, okay, what do I do, right? She's older than my mom. Like, I don't want to make a scene. So she comes closer. She takes out her little purse. She takes out her little nickel or quarter, I don't remember. And she starts to put it in my Coke. And I was like, whoa, no, don't do that. I didn't want to frighten her, because she would have actually fallen over if I had frightened her. So I needed to be gentle. But I tell that story because what I think it illustrates is absolute good intention on her part, right? She's come out, she sees a woman, at that time a young woman, youngish woman, in a chair, and this is her way of empathizing with me. She's giving alms to the poor, right? I don't see myself that way. I don't see myself as somebody who needs charity or pity. I see myself as an empowered woman. That I have a disability is only one part of my identity. I've got many other identities, all right? And so it's really, really important for us never to make assumptions about people and fall into stereotypes of what we think is good for disabled people or not. And so it's also really interesting because I find very often people will talk to my husband and not talk to me. And I'm like, hello, you can talk to me. The assumption is I don't understand, I can't. It's like I could be 3 times more qualified than you on anything you do. But you don't want to look at me because for some reason, the person that you think has the knowledge here is my partner. There's something wrong with that picture. And this is in the so-called enlightened world, right? So we have to be very honest about what the struggle is in terms of addressing disability inclusion, because it's very seeped in our traditions, in our cultures, even in our religion. But we need to think about how we can turn it around so that the narrative, and I will close on this, the narrative of disability inclusion is one that's seen as a positive one that's based on voice and agency, and looking to empower as many people as possible.